single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making yet another stand.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Chantal Destra. It's a new year, and that means the beginning of a new legislative session. Governor Kathy Hochul and the legislature have a long list of priorities to address this year, including affordability, education, healthcare, and more. While the governor is gearing up for her State of the State address on January 14th, Hochul has already unveiled her first proposal focused on affordability. And to close out 2024, the governor also acted on several pertinent bills, including vetoing the Grieving Families Act for the third year in a row and signing legislation meant to target oil companies for their involvement in environmental pollution. To unpack the governor's recent actions on these bills and to understand what to look forward to at the start of the session, we are joined at the Reporters Roundtable with our Elise Klein and Alex Gold of the Watertown Daily Times and Northern New York newspapers. Happy New Year. And toward the end of last year, we saw Governor Kathy Hochul take action on a slew of bills. And of course, that meant vetoing bills. So Elise, I know that you've been covering this broadly for us. Can you tell us about some of the most closely watched bills that were vetoed at the end of last year?
Yeah, so far she's vetoed over 100 bills. And, it's kind of interesting because a lot of the bills that she's vetoed have gotten similar kind of pushback from advocates and lawmakers alike, saying that they felt her justification for vetoing them was sort of hollow or didn't make sense to them. So a couple examples, there were a few that, advocates and have already come out and been upset about. Two of them were child care bills to address access for families to childcare, essentially related to how much they make and the hours they work, and that kind of playing into how they're able to access childcare. And both of those bills, the governor had said in her veto memo that either the social services, it would put too much of a strain on them, and also that there wasn't enough accountability in the state's financial plan to address this legislation. And advocates and lawmakers sort of felt that that was hollow. As I said, they didn't think that it made sense because they had a lot of conversations, and these are also bills that had been vetoed multiple times. Right. So they felt that there was definitely an opportunity to address this in the budget, and so they were kind of confused why that didn't end up happening, and what around the governor, they were just sort of confused about the governor's justification. Yeah. And there was also a bill called the kind of nicknamed the comptroller's bill to address state contracts that are not covered by the comptroller's review. So it would, advocates and lawmakers say it would address add more transparency for taxpayers, essentially. And the governor vetoed that bill, saying essentially that it would impede the state's ability to address emergencies, and also that it would potentially release trade secrets from the vendors. But lawmakers argued that the governor's office, because she's vetoed this multiple times, they've had multiple conversations, they've narrowed the legislation, they felt that she could, they'd be able to write the review, the summary of the contract. And also, so they weren't really sure why that wouldn't be able to why that would be releasing trade secrets. Essentially, they weren't understanding that. Mm-hmm. But they did say that they would, continue to have conversations about it. So I guess we'll see what happens with that bill.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, it's rare that we see a bill with so much support, behind it. We saw good government groups come out in support of it. We saw lawmakers, we saw the state comptroller's office come out and heavily push the governor to sign the bill. Do we see a path forward for this bill in the years to come now that she's vetoed it? And if so, what does that look like?
I think, speaking with the assembly member who introduced it, Assemblymember Solanges, and speaking with the comptroller, there's a lot of interest in getting this bill done. They introduced a version last year that was broader. It essentially would have just put the whole contract out there. That got the veto. They hoped that their negotiations this year would get them across the finish line, and they didn't. But especially with the unanimous support in the legislature, Republican, Democrat, everybody voted for it, I think we're going to see it come back up again. And I'm not hearing a ton of appetite to negotiate further cuts to it. It's already pretty watered down compared to last year's bill. So I do think we'll see that again. Path forward depends on negotiations with the governor, and she doesn't really like to play her hands in those very much.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to see. And another bill that was vetoed that was closely watched, of course, was the Grieving Families Act. This was the third year in a row that the bill was vetoed by the governor. This year, she cited inflation, and she said in her veto message that the bill posed a significant risk to consumers. And this, of course, comes at a time when the governor has been touting her affordability proposal ahead of the State address. So what did we think of the governor's message as it relates to inflation? Do we think that there's any truth to what she's alleging, or do we think that there's, some political fodder?
I think it's important to note that New York is one of only 2 states that doesn't allow you to sue in these situations where somebody is responsible for the untimely death of a loved one. It's New York and Alabama. And this bill's been kicking around for over 30 years now. It was first introduced in '94. I think we've seen inflation cited before. It doesn't seem to lead to many higher costs in the states, the majority of states that do allow it. So I'm not sure how true the inflation argument rings at the end of the day. And I know we're going to see this bill again. It's been kicking around for 30 years. It'll kick around for another 30 if it doesn't get signed.
And Elise, I know you've been covering it and speaking to advocates and people who were, pushing the governor to not sign the bill as well. So what have you been hearing from sources?
Well, families are obviously, incredibly disappointed, especially families who've lost loved ones and/or are currently, in current, wrongful death lawsuits. But lawmakers are also disappointed, and they're saying, arguing that, the healthcare and, insurance companies are actually in a really incredible time of increased profits. So they felt that, it in that way also rings a little bit hollow because insurance companies are making more money currently. And, so how would this essentially, their question, how would this essentially hurt them if they're making a lot more money? And as to Alex's point, that we're only one of 2 states. So if this is truly going to impact, a lot of what I heard from advocates was that it just didn't make sense statistically and mathematically. If this truly was going to have such a large impact, how come we're not seeing that in like the 48 other states across the country?
Right. And the governor didn't veto all the bills, right? She did sign the Climate Change Superfund, which would make oil and gas companies financially responsible for pollution. So what is the impact of the governor signing this bill, and how might this affect the state's ability to reach its climate goals?
Well, it's certainly going to lead to lawsuits. I can tell you that. There are already things filed. It's going to face a firm challenge in the courts. And I could see it going, all the way up to the top of the court system to be decided. I think if we're talking about increased costs, I think that might be more likely to cause some increased costs. If you're having, ExxonMobil paying billions of dollars a year, who's going to carry that cost? Ultimately, they're not going to let the company do that. It's going to be the people buying the gas and buying the products. So besides legal challenges, I think it might lead to some increased costs. And I'm certainly interested to see what specifically the money collected from this program actually goes towards. Because it's important to keep in mind, New York doesn't contribute all that heavily to climate change anymore. We've spent years trying to pare down our carbon emissions, and New York as a state is a small drop in the ocean of CO2 emissions. So what can we do here with that money to make a bigger impact remains to be seen.
It certainly will be interesting to see how this, plays out, especially because a lot of lawmakers pushing for it had, sort of emphasized that companies contributing towards climate change should be helping to pay for cleaning it up, which is what the state's trying to do. And, we hear a lot from, lawmakers in the legislature that, we need to address this, but how are we going to pay for it? So it would be interesting to see exactly how their vision, and now that they finally got it passed, it's been a long fight. It'll be interesting to see how it actually plays out.
And at the time we're filming this, of course, we're about less than 2 weeks away from the governor, unveiling her State of the State address. She has been putting forth some of the proposals, one of them being affordability. So I wanted to hear from each of you, what are you looking forward to most when it comes to that address on January 14th?
I think what I'm looking for, I'm interested to see what she does on school funding. That was a big conversation last year. We've got the Rockefeller report in hand, which has what's called a menu of options to address school funding, update it for the current situation. What I found interesting is that the governor burned a fair bit of political capital last year on proposing the end of hold harmless, which essentially says the state can't cut aid to a district from one year to the next. It essentially capped some districts. They were getting the same amount for years, not necessarily needing all of that money. What I found interesting is that the Rockefeller report came out, said there should be a phased end to hold harmless that should be removed from about 50% of schools. And then the governor that day comes out with a statement saying she no longer supports ending hold harmless language or removing that from state law. So I'm interested to see what the next steps are, what the agreement is. I'm sure lawmakers are talking about it now, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it into the budget process. And the other thing that I'm keeping my eye on as well is prisons. I cover the North Country. Prisons are a big part of the economy up north. We have a fair few of them built in the 80s. And interestingly, we're coming off of, December, there was a very violent death of an inmate, Robert Brooks, at Marcy Correctional in Oneida County. I'm hearing calls for prison closures. At the same time, the governor had the power to close 3 more prisons before April, but that expired yesterday. January 1st was the last day she could have announced a closure. I'm curious if she'll look for more power to close prisons, and also curious if the calls to close Marcy or Mohawk correctional facilities will be heeded.
Yeah, and I think it will be interesting, too, to see what happens in the legislature on immigration reform. I know in years past, there have been advocates have called for multiple bills to address, access issues and disparities on that front, especially with what's going to happen with the new White House administration. I think that'll be a pretty high focus. It's already been a focus in years past with the migrant crisis in New York here. So I think that will definitely be a big point of contention and something that's discussed a lot throughout the year. Whether or not that'll end up in the budget, which bills are related to financial means, I guess we'll have to wait and see. But that will certainly be interesting. And also the governor's inflation checks that she's also kind of mentioned, or inflation rebate. That will be interesting to see how that plays out, I guess. So, I'm sure New Yorkers will be excited to get at least a little bit of money back.
Well, certainly a lot to look forward to. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. But we thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we were speaking with Alex Schultz of the Watertown Daily Times and Northern New York newspapers, and our Elise Klein. And for more information on the end of year action on bills sent to the governor, you can visit our website. That's at nynow.org. And as we prepare for the start of the new legislative session, we wanted to provide a deep dive on how things work and what to expect. Here's that story from our Elise Klein.
Each year, the New York State legislative session takes place in Albany from January to June. During each session term, lawmakers go through the process of passing hundreds of bills, passing the state budget, and holding countless public hearings. Terms for members of the legislature are 2 years, and there are no limits for state lawmakers, which means they can serve as long as they are able and elected to do so. Some lawmakers, like Assemblymember John McDonald, a Democrat representing the Capital Region, have served for over a decade.
So this will be my 13th legislative session.
Each session of the state budget takes up a large portion of lawmakers' time.
It's mostly about the money. It's about finances and making sure we put forth a strong budget that represents all New Yorkers' concerns.
For some advocates, the budget is a big part of how they address issues impacting New York communities. Rob Hayes, the Senior Clean Water Director for Environmental Advocates New York, says one of their top priorities this upcoming year will be ensuring full funding for clean water.
This past session, the governor tried to cut funding for the Clean Water Infrastructure Act by 50%, but luckily the legislature and the governor worked together to restore that funding to the full amount in the final budget. Given all the new needs we see across the state to protect clean water, including by replacing lead pipes and getting toxic PFAS chemicals out of our water, we're advocating for an increase in that funding source to $600 million.
Some Democratic lawmakers say the budget each year allocates funding for important issues and at the same time lacks in areas lawmakers feel they could do more, like affordability. Senator James Skoufis, a Democrat representing Orange County, stresses affordability tackles many areas, including education, housing, utility bills, and property taxes.
So we have to do a lot more. We should be exclusively focused on this as a top set of priorities, and certainly the budget presents the best opportunity to do so.
Affordability will also be a focus for the governor. She plans to unveil a proposal to give New Yorkers inflation rebate checks as part of her State of the State address. The State of the State happens each year before the budget process begins and usually takes place a few days after session starts. During the State of the State, Governor Hochul will talk about a variety of proposals to address issues such as affordability. Following the State of the State, the governor proposes her plan for the state budget. Lawmakers then review her plan, hold about 13 lengthy budget hearings on varying issues, and come up with their plans, also called one-house budget resolutions. Then legislative leaders and the governor meet for budget negotiations for weeks, even months, before a final budget can be voted on. The state budget deadline is April 1st, and in recent years, negotiations have stretched beyond that deadline, resulting in extenders. Some Republican lawmakers say when it comes to the budget, what they are consistently disappointed in is policy such as bail reform. Senator George Borrello, a Republican representing portions of the Finger Lakes, says policy doesn't belong in the budget.
The part that I have always disliked coming from county government is the fact that we have policy, often controversial policy, that is in the budget. That just should not be.
Some lawmakers this next budget cycle are anticipating challenges around what to expect from Washington with a second Donald Trump administration coming in. Senator Natalia Fernandez, a Democrat representing parts of the Bronx and Westchester, says the biggest concern is funding cuts.
A lot of what we do, the federal government sometimes matches. If they choose to reduce their funding, then we will have to figure out how to maintain that funding. So that is going to be a question looming, in my opinion. And we won't know till we know.
Other lawmakers agree. Assemblymember McDonald says while he isn't sure the new presidential administration will have an impact on this budget cycle, he is still concerned.
I think the concern with Washington is that if there's a block grant or basically a capping of what money will be sent to New York, that it may cripple a lot of the existing programs. So we're going to have to be very vigilant.
Skoufis says it is important to be ready for potential cuts, but it is also important for the legislature not to get ahead of themselves.
And so we certainly do what we have to do to protect our financial best interests here in New York, but also not get out ahead of our skis and predict things that may or may not come to fruition.
The focus in Albany, however, isn't solely on funding. For some advocates, their focus is outside the budget. Corinne Carey, who has been an advocate for 10 years, says her priority each year remains the same: make medical aid in dying legal in New York.
I think that coming to the Capitol to advocate for this law after you've lost a loved one is painful for many of our advocates, and I share that pain. But it's also incredibly cathartic to tell these stories and to watch lawmakers change their minds after hearing some of the stories that we have to share.
Carey says while the journey hasn't been easy, she is confident this year will finally be the year the medical aid in dying fight comes to fruition.
It takes sometimes a decade for major social change like this. This is not my first rodeo. With the New York Civil Liberties Union, I worked for many years to pass significant social justice legislation. And so I think 2025 could be our year.
Advocating at the Capitol typically happens on Tuesdays, also known as Lobby Day. Hundreds of groups travel to rally and meet with lawmakers about their cause. Carey and other medical aid in dying advocates each year rally for their bill. They also set up demonstrations for the issue, highlighting New Yorkers who have died painfully, New Yorkers who wanted relief from a medical aid in dying law. Many advocates like Carey have priorities outside of the budget. Hayes says environmental advocates are pushing for legislation to get rid of polyfluoroalkyl substances or PFAS chemicals in products.
The chemical industry continues to produce more and new PFAS. I think we're up to now 9,000 PFAS chemicals in existence, of which we regulate only the tiniest fraction. And the more that we learn about these PFAS chemicals, the more dangerous that we realize that they are. That's why we need a holistic approach to ban the entire family of PFAS chemicals from products so we can stop that contamination at the source and prevent pollution of our water that requires so much time and energy and money to clean up.
3 bills are intended to do this by banning PFAS chemicals in consumer products, menstrual products, and beauty products. Senator Leah Webb, a Democrat representing Binghamton and a lead sponsor of the Beauty Justice Act, says all of these bills are important for protecting New Yorkers' health.
These are the products that we oftentimes are relying upon when you talk about storage containers that also have PFAS, whether it's menstrual hygiene products or even beauty products. These are things that we are heavily relying upon. And so it is imperative that we ensure that while we're utilizing these products, that they are not creating long-term health issues that truly could have been avoided.
The Beauty Justice Act is one example of the many bills that didn't make it across the finish line this previous session. Each session, lawmakers pass hundreds of bills, sometimes thousands. In the previous session, they passed around 800 bills. One of those bills, the Retail Worker Safety Act, passed both houses and was signed by the governor. The Retail Worker Safety Act would require employers to develop and implement programs to prevent workplace violence, direct the Department of Labor to produce a model workplace violence prevention training program, and require the installation of panic buttons or wearable mobile phone-based panic buttons at certain workplaces. Theodore Moore, executive director of Align, an alliance of labor and community organizations, says it was incredible to watch this legislation pass the state legislature and be signed into law.
A lot of times we see problems, but we don't actually have the ability to come up with the solution and actually implement it. So to work on an issue that will actually, improve the safety of workers across the state and actually, embolden them to be better workers themselves and be safer in their jobs is absolutely amazing.
Moore added advocates spend a lot of time outside of the session schedule from January to June, anxiously waiting for bills they rallied for to get signed. For example, the Warehouse Worker Injury Reduction Act to establish an injury reduction program was signed just before the new year. Moore says it is a huge victory for workers.
It's really a huge deal because what WIRA does is it establishes industry-wide safety standards. So it requires annual safety evaluations of large warehouses at companies like Amazon for hazards and ergonomic fixes. It improves the training and medical care in those facilities as well. And then it gives power to the Department of Labor to implement and enforce the law.
For a bill to pass, it starts with an introduction. Then it goes through a designated committee, and if it is voted to move on, it goes to the floor for a vote. The last step is the governor has to review the bill and decide how to act on it. For a bill to move smoothly, lawmakers really have to work together, and this year there are some new members. Assemblymember McDonald says it may take some time for lawmakers to find their rhythm.
We have 21 new members in the Assembly, 15 in the majority, 6 in the minority. Admittedly, it takes a while to get to know everybody. And, it's important to have relationships with your colleagues because when you have relationships, you can have better conversations. We have better conversations, items that may not be of interest to me, but may be of interest to somebody in Brooklyn or Buffalo. By having those relationships, you're able to better understand them. And I think we are supposed to be a deliberative body. I'd like to think that we are.
In addition to new members, there are also some new leadership roles, including a new minority floor leader and a new speaker pro tem in the Assembly who both help facilitate debates on the floor. The next pro tem, replacing Jeff Aubrey, has not been chosen yet, but some lawmakers anticipate this will happen by the first session day on January 8th at the latest.
And that's important. Member Aubrey, who really was the pro tem the whole 12 years I've been here, was remarkable. He could make it a light atmosphere when it was necessary, but he could also make sure that people understood that there's decorum.
The majority floor leader is Assemblymember Crystal Peoples-Stokes, who has served in this role for several years. And the minority floor leader replacing Andy Goodell, who retired last year, is Assemblymember Mary Beth Walsh. Walsh says she is excited to take on this important role.
Well, I came into the Assembly 8 years ago, really wondering, like, am I suited for this? Am I going to be qualified? Am I going to fit in? Am I going to do well? And I think one of the things that feels really good about being selected to be the floor leader is that I feel that within my conference, I've earned the respect of my colleagues and the leader that I am a reasonable person, a reasonable legislator who can put words behind that and try to help lead the discussion that we do have on legislation.
Before politicos know it, the busiest time at the Capitol winds down and legislative session officially ends. Lawmakers then leave the state capitol for the year. At the end of the 2024 session last year, lawmakers returned home to their respective districts to be amongst their constituents and to do their legislative work in their communities. In the coming days, lawmakers will return to Albany for the 2025 session, many of them with a myriad of these pertinent policy issues on their minds. Elise Klein, New York Now.
And for more on that, you can subscribe to our newsletter at newsletter.nynow.org. Now turning to our last important topic. WMHT is celebrating 50 years of state capitol reporting, dating back to 1975 with Inside Albany and today with New York Now. As we reflect on the extraordinary journalism through the years, we'll be sharing a 30-minute documentary unpacking the show's legacy and impact during next week's program. We'll also be having a special screening of the documentary in our studio on January 9th at 6 p.m. For more details, you can visit our website. Again, that's at nynow.org. Well, that does it for this edition of New York Now. Thank you for tuning in and see you next week.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET,